I see many familiar faces here today because so many of you are on the teams of people that I've been working with at the President's direction to reform the way regulations are written in Washington. Also, some of our most progressive federal employees are here who have reinvented the way regulations are actually enforced around the country. As all of you know, President Clinton has made regulatory reform one of his top priorities, and he's made it one of my top priorities. Back on September 30th, 1993, President Clinton issued Executive Order 12866, which was acclaimed by the business community, the public interest community, the environmental community, etc., as a model of the right way to reform the regulatory process. Also, from the very beginning, when President Clinton launched the National Performance Review, he told me time and time again that regulatory reform must be a central part of reinventing government, because we do intend to make government work better and cost less. I have been leading at his direction an effort of similar magnitude to the Reinventing Government project to find new ways that we can achieve our national goal of a healthy economy at work in a healthy and safe environment. Over the past several months, we have covered a lot of regulatory territory. We've been having numerous very long nuts and bolts sessions here in this building a couple of floors down. And we've learned two basic practical lessons. First, we can cut back on the volume of regulations, and we are doing just that. Secondly, we can improve the relationship between regulators and the people they regulate. And when we do these things, we get better results for our country. If you rummage through the code of federal regulations, as we've been doing, you will find things that look worth keeping, things that seem old-fashioned, and some things that you can't figure out what in the heck they are. It's like what you're faced with when you finally get around to cleaning out the garage. And no president before this one has ever done it. But now we are in the midst of it, and we're making tremendous progress. Here's what happened when one agency, the controller of the currency, went to work and hauled out all of its regulatory trash, so to speak. They found that while it's a good idea to calculate bank lending limits 4 times a year, it doesn't really need to be done every single day the way the old regulation required. That's 246 procedures per year per bank hauled out to the curb with the trash every day. They found that if they translated from their stilted regulatory language into plain English, they only need 1/4 as many words, and more Americans like me can understand it. Along with some streamlining, this allowed them to get the procedures for a community bank exam down from 1,216 pages to just 30 pages. That's a lot of pages hauled away, and believe me, the President's been receiving a lot of letters from community bankers who have been saying, "Thank you, Mr. President, for this work that has been done." Also, now that the nation has enough experience with those newfangled automatic teller machines, the controller of the currency decided to throw out the entire application process, all 30 cautious steps that banks had to follow before installing a new machine. They got rid of yesterday's government, to use President Clinton's phrase. This kind of regulatory cleanup lets regulatory agencies pay more attention to real problems, and it lifts a huge load of dead weight off American business. According to Bankers Roundtable, the changes the Currency Bureau has already made and others that are in the works will result in, and I quote, "a more efficient and competitive national bank system, better serving customers and shareholders." The controller of the currency, Gene Ludwig, who is leading this reform, And one of his satisfied customers, speaking for many thousands of others, Jack Dickey, who is president of the First National Bank of Thompson, Oklahoma, are both with us today. I'd like to ask Gene Ludwig and Jack Dickey to please stand. Great job, Gene. Thank you for coming, sir. The Commerce Department's Bureau of Export Administration is another example. It's also in the midst of clearing away the debris that has built up over the years. They recognize that while it is important to prevent goods with military application from getting into the wrong hands, the Cold War is in fact over, and it no longer makes sense to follow the same elaborate rules that were written in 1949. So they've begun to whittle down the volumes of regulations, and they're not just throwing away useless ones, they're also rethinking the entire approach from the ground up. Exports used to be prohibited unless you got permission. Now you'll be able to sell most products abroad unless the government acts to specifically designate the product as requiring a license. This ought to increase exports and create new American jobs. It's already doing so. So it is possible to cut back on the bulk of regulations, simplify them, and get better results. But the number of complex regulations is only half the problem. As President Clinton has repeatedly emphasized, it is also the adversarial and seemingly mindless enforcement methods that really get under people's skins. Business owners are sick of being treated like criminals. They see a government that just doesn't make sense, that charges them with safety violations when no one is in harm's way. A government that protects the environment by using up forest after forest worth of paperwork. A government that is obsessed with procedures but oblivious to results. We found out what causes this problem. It involves an elementary management principle. You get what you measure. Generally speaking, regulatory agencies have been measuring process and punishment. They evaluate the performance of frontline workers in those terms. Now, I know there are plenty of exceptions on the part of pioneers who have helped lead the way and who have helped us learn this lesson that informs what the President is ordering today. But generally speaking, this has been the case. They evaluate whether people have checked all the forms properly. They evaluate how many violations they've found. They evaluate how many fines they have issued. It's the same kind of pressure that some traffic cops have to meet when they're given a ticket quota for each month. Over 80% of frontline performance measures involve process or punishment. Agencies even measure their corporate productivity in terms of process and punishment, investigations, inspections, arrests. One of the clearest examples we found is one that Ann Brown inherited at the Consumer Product Safety Commission. And let me make it clear, they're in the process of changing their measures of success, but one that was there measured the number of shipments of imported consumer products detained at dockside. So somebody who was doing a really good job would have lots of consumer products detained at dockside. That was a measure of success. If you weren't detaining products at dockside, if they weren't stacking up, then you weren't doing a good job. And so the measure is being changed. It didn't matter whether the boxes contained dangerous products or safe products, even if the boxes are empty. If you could detain them at dockside, you could chalk up a success. And anybody who wonders why adversarial relationships between business owners and regulators develop, there is part of the answer, and it's being fixed because of good, strong leadership and President Clinton's direction and insistence. It doesn't have to be that It doesn't have to stay the way it was. It can change, and it must. And we found quite a few excellent models of partnership between business owners and regulators. Partnerships that are focused on results, not on process and punishment. One of the finest examples we came across is in Miami, where the Customs Service has formed a partnership with the trade community, a partnership that makes businesses more profitable and actually increases their compliance with customs regulations. Rael Pedraza, the president of Eagle Companies, a Miami-based shipper, recently wrote a letter to Lynn Gordon, the district director of Customs, in which he said that the positive change is a dramatic departure from that which permeated federal agencies in the past, end quote. And there are hundreds, indeed thousands, of similar examples of business people noting the positive change that is now evident. Mr. Pedraza cites cuts in red tape that are saving his company over 8,000 man-hours of overhead this year and stimulating new jobs in the community. In closing, Mr. Pedraza says, and I quote, "It is comforting to know that at least in Miami, the Customs Service has put the word service back in its name." I'd like to ask Mr. Pedraza and Lynn Gordon, who are both in the audience, to stand and take a bow. Great job. And Mr. President, as I've mentioned to you, Lynn Gordon is one of the frontline regulators reinventing this whole process, who spent a lot of time here helping us learn how the change process comes about. And just as with the National Performance Review, we are learning the most from the federal employees on the front lines who've been speaking out, trying to change a lot of the nonsense for years, but have had no one who would listen to them until you took office and sent out the word, we've got to change and we want the good ideas that you have for us. There's another example in Maine where Joe Deere and the Occupational Safety and Health Administration formed a partnership with the state's most hazardous industries, a partnership that has resulted in much safer workers and a lot less paperwork. The Environmental Protection Agency has put partnership to work too. In their 3350 program, 1,400 companies agreed to cut pollution in half by the end of this year, and many of them are ahead of that schedule. In the Brownsfield project, EPA, the states, and local organizations teamed up, in this case in Cleveland, to deal with toxic waste on abandoned property, and the project has already created 100 new private sector jobs. And in the EPA WasteWise program, 350 companies are voluntarily setting up recycling programs because it's good for their bottom line and good for the environment. So, Mr. President, these examples convince me that we do indeed know how to reduce regulation. We do know how to perform successful partnerships. We do know how to switch from red tape to results. If we take these examples to heart, we can achieve the goal of a healthy economy at work in a healthy and safe environment. And now, ladies and gentlemen, the person who started this process, who has insisted from day one that we have reform, yes, rollback, no. The person who has insisted that we reinvent the whole regulatory process to keep the protections that the American people support and justly demand, but eliminate the red tape, the nonsense, the unnecessary features that burden business. The person who is leading this charge, the President of the United States, Bill Clinton.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I want to begin by thanking the Vice President for his leadership on this issue. When we formed our partnership back in 1992, and we talked about all the things we wanted to do. And you know, we had a series of long, fascinating conversations in which he talked to me about science and technology and the environment, and I talked to him about education and economic development and reinventing government. And I told him that when I was a governor, every couple of years we'd eliminate an agency just to see if anybody noticed. And normally they didn't. And they never did complain when they did notice. And I asked him if he would, then after we actually won and came here, I asked him if he would get involved in this and really try to make it work for the American people, because I was convinced that there was so much justifiable anxiety out there among our people about the way government operates that unless we could change that, we'd never be able to maintain the faith of the taxpayers and the integrity of the federal government. I also asked him to do it because he was the only person I could trust to read all 150,000 pages in the Code of Federal Regulations. At this very moment, Tipper is being treated for insomnia at the Georgetown Hospital, but he's just about through. I also want to thank all of you who are here, who represent really the future of the federal government and the future of its ability to maintain the confidence of the American people that we're protecting and promoting their interest and doing it in a way that reinforces instead of defies common sense. I believe very strongly in the cause of regulatory reform, and as the Vice President said, we've been working at it for about 2 years now. I also believe that we have to hold fast to certain standards. I believe we can bring back common sense and reduce hassle without stripping away safeguards for our children, our workers, our families. There are proposals pending in the Congress today which go beyond reform to roll back, arguably even to wrecking. And I oppose them, but I believe we have the burden of reform. And that means we have to change in fundamental ways the culture of regulation that has permeated this government throughout administrations, from administration to administration, from Republicans to Democrats occupying the White House. The federal government, to many people, is not the President of the United States. It's the person who shows up on the doorstep to check out the bank records, or the safety in the factory, or the integrity of the workplace, or how the nursing home is being run. I believe that we have a serious obligation in this administration to work with the Congress to reduce the burden of regulation and to increase the protection to the public. And we have an obligation on our own to do what we can to change the destructive elements of the culture of regulation that is built up over time and energize the legitimate and decent things that we should be doing here in Washington, and more importantly, that should be being done all across the country. I thank those who have come here today as examples of the progress which has been made. We do want to get rid of yesterday's government so we can meet the demands of this new time. We do want results, not rules. We want leaner government, not meaner government. At a time when I have said our obligation should be to create more opportunity and also to provide more responsibility, our responsibility here is to expand opportunity, empower people to make the most of their own lives, enhance security, and to do it all while we are shrinking the federal bureaucracy. To give the people a government as effective as our finest private companies, to give our taxpayers their money's worth. Now, everybody has talked about this for years now, but in fact we have taken steps in the right direction. Already we have reduced federal spending by over $250 billion, reduced the size of the federal payroll by over 100,000. We are on our way to a reduction in excess of 250,000 in the federal workforce, which will give us, by the end of this decade, the smallest federal government since the Kennedy administration. Vice President Gore's leadership in the Reinventing Government initiatives have already saved taxpayers $63 billion. Some of the more visible changes have been well noted. The reduction of offices in the Agriculture Department by more than 1,200. Throwing away the government's 10,000-page personnel manual. Hadn't heard a single soul complain about it. Nobody has said, you know, I never thought about the personnel manual, but I just can't bear to live without it now. I haven't heard it a single place. We've worked hard to solve problems that had been long ignored, reforming the pension benefit guarantee system to secure the pensions of 8.5 million working Americans whose pensions and retirement were at risk, reforming government procurement so that the days of the $500 hammer and the $10 glass ashtray are over, turning FEMA from a disaster into a disaster relief agency, breaking gridlock on bills that hung around in Congress for years, 6 or 7 years, like the family leave law, the motor voter law, the Brady bill, the crime bill. But maybe the most stubborn problem we face is this problem of regulation. How do we do what we're supposed to do here? How do we help to reinforce the social contract and do our part to work with the private sector to protect the legitimate interests of the American people without literally taking leave of our senses and doing things that drive people up the wall but don't make them safer? We all want the benefits of regulation. We all want clean air and clean water and safe food and toys that our children can play with. But let's face it, we all know the regulatory system needs repair. Too often that the rule writers here in Washington have such detailed lists of do's and don'ts that the do's and don'ts undermine the very objectives they seek to achieve. When clear goals and operations for cooperation would work better. Too often, especially small businesses, face a profusion of overlapping and sometimes conflicting rules. We've tried to set up an effective procedure here for resolving those conflicts, but it drives people crazy. I had somebody just yesterday mention being subject to 2 directly conflicting rules from 2 federal agencies. We have to move beyond the point where Washington is, to use the Vice President's phrase, the sort of national nanny that can always tell businesses, consumers, and workers not only what to do, but exactly how to do it, when, and with a 100-page guideline. And as already been said, we have begun to take the first steps in doing this. You've heard about what the Comptroller of the Currency has done. I can tell you one thing. When I was out in New Hampshire in 1992, I heard more grief about the regulation of the private sector by the Comptroller of the Currency than any other single thing. And now every time